Hi, and welcome. Good morning. Yeah, so let me explain a little bit. So for the last 4 years, I've worked in IBM corporate, and I've been responsible for, as we say, open source and standards. Now, in the US, as well as other places, we have this notion of separation of church and state, okay? The idea is that with the church, you have the theology, the big ideas, right? And the state, you have the actual running of the country and the money and all these sorts of things like this. So with that analogy, and I hope it translates, what I was doing the last 4 years was very much church. That is, it was involved with how IBM, inside IBM, dealt with open source. So how would IBM make the legal decisions that yes, we would use this open source, or we would contribute to this community, or we should ship it with this product and so forth. And the same with standards. And we worked with governments around the world really to talk about open source, talk about standards, and lately, especially about procurement policies. So you may know a few weeks ago, the UK government issued a statement saying that open source and traditional proprietary software should be treated on a completely level playing field. Now, if you're really into open source, you may say that's not good enough. Open source has to be special, right? But that is such an improvement over the situation the way it was, right? Where in many governments, in fact, they wouldn't consider open source at all. It's very much a trend-setting type of thing. My new job, which is I've had for about 2 months now, is more on the state side, the business side. So I've moved over into IBM Software Group, and I'm responsible for the part of our business that sells software to run on Linux, all right? So Linux is obviously a great operating system. It runs on many different platforms, a lot of technology to it. We have over 500 products that run on it, so forth and so forth. I was invited to give this talk for the first job, right? So even though I'm in the middle of the whole IBM business around open source, this is very much about the ideas around open source. And I'm not going to mention any IBM products. You'll see the logo. That's the only thing you'll see. And we'll just talk about ideas. Okay? All right, so let's start with that. So, the ICT industry, it's even though there's a tremendous amount going on in terms of the economic crisis, financial issues, environmental crisis, there's a lot happening today in terms of innovation ideas in the ICT industry. The ideas that many of us have been working with for the last few years are having great effect, as I mentioned before, in government, in business, in other places as well. But there are always certain things when you talk about computer science and ICT in general that you can really get people upset about, and you can get real arguments going. So a great way of starting a fight in this industry is to try to define what open means, right? You can rarely find two people who completely agree what open standard should be, much less open source, and frankly, it causes some problems, all right? Now, open is very popular today. It's good to be open. It's good to say that you're open. But not everyone who says that they're open is really open, right? As I term it here, some people, once they decided that this was popular, they said everything they had ever done was open, right? And it's all marketing. There's nothing behind it other than they print it on a piece of paper, put it on their website, and suddenly they become open. Now, on the other extreme, you do have people, and I praise these people because this is important, but they can have very, very deep discussions about what free is, right? And that is important. I'm not criticizing them, but they're just really at the other end of the spectrum from the people who aren't actually open, right? These are the people who care very deeply, but sometimes this doesn't always translate to business discussions, right? It's just a little bit not what some people want to say. And then there are the people in the middle, right? Who understand that if we look at everything that is ICT, There are some areas that maybe are a little bit more open, if you will, than others, particularly if we're talking about the web, we're talking about the internet. People just have to admit that things like open standards, W3C standards, IETF standards, Apache open source, right? Very open. It's just undeniable. And then when you move away from that area, then sometimes people start to not be quite so sure. So when we talk about openness, you know, it's not really just about this last point, if you will, the freeness of it. When we talk about open standards, when we talk about open source, we have to include other things. So, participation. Who gets to take part? Can I just decide for any open source project to walk up and put code in it? Right? I just decide I want to do that. It's open, I should be able to do that, right? Well, that's not how most projects work, right? I mean, I have to prove myself a little bit. In the same way with open standards, sometimes the participation is free if I happen to give them 75,000 euros. And then I can freely participate, right? Transparency means that people can see what's going on, right? So I may want to know how a particular community works. I may want to know that an open source community is particularly democratic, that the best ideas were considered as opposed to one person forcing his or her ideas on everybody else. That may be okay, but I want to know about it. And in the same way with open standards, I would think that you would like to make sure that maybe a company like IBM isn't forcing our will on other people as well. So transparency is very much in the same idea as seeing. You can look into it, you can see how it operates. Now, accountability means, well, why do these people get to do what they're doing? Who says it is all right? Who gives them the authority? We saw this a lot in the very now famous battles over the so-called open XML format, where there were many, many issues in countries about national standards bodies and how they voted on this specification, where they and how they came to their decision, and what did this have to do particularly with representing their country, right? Were they part of the government? Were they random people who somehow call themselves national standards bodies? It varied tremendously. In many places such as Europe, it was a very well-defined structure. Doesn't mean there weren't issues, but in other places they almost seemed to make it up as they went along. So that is, how were the people who were creating either the standards or you could say the code accountable to the people who supported them, sponsored them, right, who were their patrons? Availability comes down to who has access to the code, who has access to the standards. Can you read it? Can you use it? Which is the last point as well. So all these things come in with open. It's not just, is it free or how free? It's all these different parts. Okay? Now, part of the problem is, it is still the case today that when you read an article in a newspaper or online, they will often get open source and standards confused, right? They'll be talking about a standard and they'll call it an open source standard. And I don't quite know what that means, right? And sometimes they'll refer to open source as standards. Now, we may like to think of some things like Linux as a standard because everyone should use it and everyone likes it and so forth. But as we know, it's not really what we would call a specification or a standard. Now, the problem with this is that, as we know, there have been people who have very much opposed open source, right? And frankly, in my opinion, those people still oppose open source. They just have gotten better at hiding it, okay? And there have been people who are opposed to open standards. So this confusion is good, because they could go in to customers and say, look at how crazy this is. It's confused. People don't know what's happening here or there. Stay away from it. Buy my product, okay? And that means that many of the rest of us who were working on what we would consider real open standards, these democratic, transparent, free efforts, as well as open source, had to go in and explain to customers and other people what really was the case. It was our responsibility to get rid of the confusion that other people deliberately put into the system. And this is part of the problem of when there is this confusion. So it's not just education. It's not just simply explaining to people what is what. It is sometimes undoing deliberate confusion, right? And it's not helped when people are confused and just say the wrong thing and then 100,000 people read it. We have to fix that, all right? So there are several reasons for the confusion, part of what I just mentioned. But if you are a technical person, I think you have to realize that most people don't know what software really looks like. They could not tell PHP from Java, from C++, or anything else, right? They may use software on their computers or on the web, but they don't know what code is. They don't know what you do with code. They don't know what a compiler is, right? They don't know what subversion is, or if they do, they think it's a very bad idea, right? And so therefore, when we go around and we just talk about open source code, they don't know what code is, okay? So the technical community, therefore, has to be very careful in terms of explaining itself. But as a result, this term open source has now been extended to many other areas. If you go on the web and do a search, the search I used was strange uses of open source. And just a few of the things that popped up were novels, books of fiction that were open source, theology, there's church and state again, but theology, open source religion, open source biology, all right? Which is really, I don't think, where the term came from. Now for standards, right, on the other side, standards are like blueprints. Standards don't actually implement anything. They tell you that when you are now ready to do something, when you are ready to build an interface, right? When you're ready to format some information to give it to somebody else, these are the rules that you should use. And if you follow these rules, other people can do something with it. Systems can communicate, for example. Open standards are the enemy of lock-in, right? So traditional lock-in means a vendor has a product, and they want you to get that product, and they want to make it very hard, once you use the product, to move to anybody else's product, all right? When you have standards, systems can talk to each other, and sometimes even you can take out some software from one vendor, put it on the side, discard it, and put in something completely different from somebody else, because all the interfaces are the same. The standards that are used are the same. So for those people, those companies who want to lock people in, of course they fight standards. They don't want to make it easy for you to leave. Now, I don't believe that's how you should keep customers. And this is true whether you're talking about traditional proprietary software or open source software. The way you keep customers and users is you have better software, right? It's good software. It doesn't crash. If your software is free and you provide a service as the way that you make your money, maintenance, you do it on a timely basis. Your software is fast. Your software is secure. This is what people pay for, and this is the way how you should keep customers instead of using some trick to force them to stay where you are. So let's do an approximate definition for open standards to say that an open standard is one that's developed and maintained in a particularly transparent way with community involvement, all right? So here's the involvement, the participation, there's the transparency, and is, quote, freely available and implementable. And I put freely in quotes. We're going to come back to this notion of freely and what it really means. So open source, right, just to contrast now with standards, is real code, honest to goodness code in some programming language, as I mentioned, like PHP or Python and so on and so on. It may implement open standards. In fact, some of the best open source code, in terms of being widely usable by many people, implement standards. And again, we could have a definition about how it's created, about saying it's built and maintained in a particularly transparent way with community involvement and is, quote, freely available. Very, very similar to the notion of open standards. Now, just so we don't end up talking about open source movies and open source novels and things like this, there are other licenses available if you want to give away content, non-programming source code. And they're from the Creative Commons. There are 6 different licenses you can use. They probably make more sense than trying to put some sort of open source license on. There are some others as well, but those are the primary ones. Now, open source helps standards a lot, all right? It's a great way of speeding up the adoption of standards. In the 1990s, late 1990s, we discovered this with XML. As the XML specification was being developed in 1995, 96, 97, there was a parallel process going on in Apache for developing an XML parser. Now, XML parsers are not easy to write in complete parsers. So you would have a choice. You'd say, I like this XML. I want to use this in my product. Oh, now I'll go and write a parser. And in 6 months, you would have an XML parser that would not be perfect. It would be buggy. And you even forgot why you wanted an XML parser because you've been spending all your time writing it. So the idea was to speed up the adoption of the XML standard by freely giving people an open source XML parser. So I see the standard and I say, there's code I can use today, right? And I can put that in my product, and tomorrow my product can be using XML. You can become much, much more effective. And in this case, Apache was useful. And I know there's great debate about licenses and GPL versus non-GPL, but particularly with XML, we wanted everybody to be able to use it. Everybody. The value was if open source projects used it as well as traditional software. So the Apache license was particularly good that way. If you had an open source project, use it. If you have proprietary software, use it. Because the main point was getting as many people as possible to use the standard, all right? And to exchange information using that. So you can use open source code to quickly add software to support the standards, and there have been many other examples as well. So getting back to this question about why can't people agree on this open business, it really does come down, in most cases, to a discussion of this thing about free, right? Free as in speech versus free as in beer, these discussions. But even if you look at the open software and open source initiative, rather, there are about 60 different licenses there, right? There are all the GPLs, there's the Apaches, there's the Eclipse, and so forth and so forth. Now, these 60 some odd licenses really scare people who don't do this every day. They say, how would I possibly make sense of 60 different open source licenses? And they look at all of us, everybody who's involved with the community, and say, why can't you just agree, right? 60 is too many. Why do we need these little differences between the licenses? Well, it turns out that about 10 of these licenses account for about 94% of all free and open source projects. And then the other 6% are these other 50 licenses. But it is still the case, I would argue, that 60 is way, way, way too many. Probably about 50 too many. Just as I mentioned, the Creative Commons uses about 6. probably about 10 or 12 licenses should make most people happy in the open source world. In the standards world, it's even worse. Now, I'm joking and saying there are several million. But literally, it is the case that as you look from standards group to standards group to standards group, they each make up their own license. Now, what that means is, if you are a corporation and you have to worry about using standards, you don't just pay for computer programmers, software developers, you have to pay for lawyers and attorneys. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but attorneys get paid a lot more than software developers, all right? I mean, I could hire several software developers sometimes for the price of one attorney, particularly if he or she's very good. So this problem really comes down to this notion of freeness or right to use, right to implement. And in the long run, we're going to have to fix this problem. This is ridiculous. We're wasting far too much time and energy, and we have far too much experience to really let people get away with saying, oh, I'm special. I have to change this one little part just to be different because I'm different and I'm wonderful, right? We have to get people to agree on this. Okay? So here are a couple of recommendations regarding open standards. First, don't try to use exactly the same definition of what an open standard is for everything. This is a practical recommendation. There's a big difference today in terms of licensing around software and different types of software and hardware. And then when you go to the international standards groups, you know, they build standards for mining and safety and agriculture. Right? Talk to them about free standards for agriculture. They don't know what you mean, okay? You may come from the deepest open source community, and some of these traditional standards areas do not understand really what you're all talking about. It's not the model for this business. So therefore, you have to be careful. If you're talking about so-called software interoperability standards, yeah, I mean, most of those are free. Some people are still fighting this, but 2 years ago, for 155 different software interoperability standards, we gave a patent non-assertion. We said we're not going to go after anybody for our patents on these standards if they're necessary. Right? 2 years ago. Where's everybody else? Almost 5 years ago, IBM did a patent pledge and said we would not sue anybody for things in the Linux kernel, right? Is that over? Has everyone decided to stop suing people for what's in the Linux kernel? Okay, maybe some questions you want to ask some other people later today. All right, so this notion of RAND, don't try to do one size fits all. There are a lot of people who try to say, oh, RAND is wonderful, it works for everything, it's always worked for everything. Don't let them get away with it. You have to say, what area are you talking about? What are the current practices in that area? Don't try to let anybody, right, for areas around the web, tell you about their patent that they're going to charge you for. But I'm sorry to tell you this, in other parts of the standard world, that is the way business operates today. Things are changing, but is the way. And if you want to look at who are the most progressive about standards, look at the consortia, the OASISes, the W3Cs, rather than the international standards groups. The consortia are much more at the forefront, and the other groups are lagging behind. So finally, in this area, I want to say, we can talk about the similarities between open standards and open source, and I've mentioned communities and transparency and free and things like this. But, you know, these groups are really separate. In my experience, and I've been doing standards now for about a dozen years, you don't have very many open source people working in standards organizations. Most of them, to be honest with you, come from traditional proprietary companies, even if they then let them be used by open source. Okay? Um, Open source groups themselves don't usually create formal standards, though they may, by virtue of creating software with programming interfaces, create de facto standards. In the future, I think we're going to figure out how to get these groups closer together. There have been some experiments that really haven't taken off quite yet, saying, for example, can we use an Apache model for open source, but to create standards? It's an interesting idea. We should keep thinking about this. The problem is we still get into lots of these very basic legal discussions. So even people who really think that's the way to go find themselves repeating much of the work that traditional standards organizations have had to do just to set themselves up as organizations. So just let me leave you with some questions in this section here about why are they separate communities. Are people who do open source just different in some way from people who want to do standards? Is it different from the way they want to spend their time? Are the license issues incompatible? Right? That is, if I'm creating open source, how do I decide to make this available? GPL doesn't apply to a standard the way it might apply to source code. All right? Are they just interested in different things? Or this issue, which is saying, look, if I make a standard, if I also want to create open source code for that standard, what language do I use? Right? For a long time, we would say, well, of course, you use Java. Right? You have a standard, you use Java. Right? Now, there are other programming languages, but there were certain people who felt, no, they did not want to use Java. Right? They would not touch Java. And so therefore, you get into these situations where saying, well, if I create a standard and I'm creating open source, I have to do it in Java, I have to do it in C#, I've got to do it in PHP, and the whole process gets bigger and bigger and bigger and more complicated. Okay, so let's start another fight. So I started this by saying, how do you start a fight in the ICT industry? You try to define open. A really current way of doing this is try to define cloud. Last 2 weeks, all right? And it boils down to this thing, which you may have seen in the news. This was an attempt to, in fact, it was carried out, to get a lot of people together at the beginning of this so-called cloud computing era and just decide and state some direction about the use of open standards for clouds. Okay? Seems like a fairly reasonable thing to do. Now, the reason why it got in the news was that even though 60 companies signed on to this, there were a few who didn't. And they claimed various reasons, and I'll let them speak for themselves. But really, the point of this is to start the conversation and to give a message to cloud users and cloud customers that they should be very aware of what these clouds are that they're starting to use and how maybe the rules need to be really closely watched so you don't find yourself locked in. So there were 6 principles of this, and I'm going to end the talk here by just discussing these principles. And tell me if these seem so strange. All right, so these are the first 2 principles. Cloud providers must work together to ensure that the challenges to cloud adoption, security, integration, portability, interoperability, governance management, metering monitoring, it's a long list, are addressed through open collaboration and the appropriate use of standards. So what this says is, first of all, when we really talk about this technology that is cloud computing, it's not just one thing. It's not just storage. It's not just hosting an image, right? There are lots of different levels to it, different technologies like security, management that need to be involved. And what this is saying is, folks, let's use open standards, right? Let's not invent proprietary mechanisms, all right? So that we don't end up in a situation of saying, look, once again, Somebody who is market position is going to try to lock in customers. So what we're saying is that the way you keep customers, as I said before, is by having better clouds. More uptime, faster, more secure, and you don't lock customers in because of your particular current market position. Now, who would this bother? This would bother anybody with a strong current market position who's saying, I'm not gonna let this standard stuff interrupt my trying to take over the world as far as clouds go, okay? Cloud providers must use and adopt existing standards where appropriate. We're seeing this sort of language more and more. You know, there have been several stimulus bills in the United States. And in fact, in the area around energy, there's a statement in there that says that people have to use open internet standards. So what we're saying here is that where good standards exist, use them. Don't go off and create something different just to be different. Don't waste our time. And in the same way, don't waste our time with having very heavily bureaucratic standards groups that go on for years and years and years that seem like the only thing they want to do is to create standards versus creating clouds. So these two statements taken together represent a balance that says use the best of what we have actively, really try to reuse, and when you do decide you have to create something new, do it, but do it efficiently, all right? So it is not anti-standards, it's very pro-standards, but saying we're building clouds, not 1,000 standards. Oops. Okay, and the last 2 points here, clouds are about customers, not about vendors. What do people need? What do companies, what do organizations need from clouds versus, gee, this fits my business plan, so therefore I'm going to force it on you, all right? And all these groups, finally, need to work together, that we don't want the industry to fracture, to break apart early on, but rather we want to see people committing to saying that we're going to move forward quickly and in a coordinated way. All right, so that's it. If you want to read the whole thing yourself, it's at opencloudmanifesto.org. And I put this up really as, you know, it was published on Monday. So it's fairly new, and it really ties in, I think, a lot of these ideas. So let me conclude here with this. So I've examined openness from a few different directions. I've tried to show where open source and open standards are similar, where they're different, where there might be confusion. But no matter how you look at it, and no matter how you personally define this word open, every day the world seems a little bit more open somehow, some way. Sometimes a lot more, sometimes just a little. There is not one definition of open standard that works for everybody. Typically, when people try to force one definition on you, it's extremely restrictive, and in fact, it's not very open. So don't let them get away with that. So in this same way, if you think of this move toward openness as a movement, that whether it's open source, free open source, right? Open standards, people will fight it with word games and all these twists and strange arguments, and they're wasting your time, and they're wasting a lot of people's time. It's how they're trying to fight it because, and I think most of them realize it, that this movement toward greater openness can be sped up or it can be slowed down. I think everyone realizes it can't be stopped. They're trying to slow it down. So if you want to speed it up, know what to look for, be precise in your language, clear up the confusion, and we'll all do okay. Okay? So thank you very much.